Hi everyone, I'm Ludo, and welcome back to RenovHome. In this episode, I'm rebuilding the floor structure that I dismantled in the previous one. This beam supporting the staircase won't be staying, as I want to make the opening wider for a much more comfortable staircase in the future. Let's head downstairs. This incredibly realistic 3D masterpiece gives you a rough idea of where the new beam will sit. Since it'll be close to the doorway, I also decided to build a timber support that will carry both the new beam and the existing one above the door on the right. I also moved the temporary wiring I installed at the beginning of the renovation. Trust me, it's a work of art. While I'm at it, I chip away the sections of wall that won't be accessible later on. That way I can check for any hidden damage beneath the plaster. Speaking of plaster, this room is covered with cement render. Va de retro, Satanas. Poor Pokey is really starting to worry now. I'm literally demolishing his living room. A merciless battle. Hopefully he won't remember me when he gets his revenge. Pretending I didn't notice anything unusual, I carry on with the demolition. Not really a surprise since there was already a crack, but this small brick vault definitely needs a bit of repair. I add a temporary prop while I prepare the area that will need fresh mortar. Unfortunately, with the prop in place, I can't close the front door anymore, so I temporarily brace it against the timber beam resting on the vault and add a support beam that should let me shut the door. Perfect, it works. Time to remove everything that's seen better days. There's nothing too serious here, but filling it all with fresh mortar certainly won't hurt, especially since the load from the beam will eventually be transferred onto the new support anyway. There we go, looking much better. Time to call it a day, and I'll see you tomorrow in front of the house. I cut the first tenon on my first post. It's a little shorter than I'd normally like because these timbers are slightly too short, but in this situation that's absolutely fine. One down, and two. Next, I cut the cross beam to length and mark out the mortises. I'll use my router to remove most of the material before cleaning everything up with chisels. Then I make the joint between the cross beam and the original floor beam. And, of course, I cut the mortises on the wrong side. So now I get to make them all over again on the other side. Oh well, these things happen. Ouch! Hang on a second. Was that clamp thrown at me by Pookie from upstairs? Then, disaster strikes. I'd love to tell you Pookie tripped me over, but unfortunately, I can't blame him this time. I learned two things that day. Tongue and groove paneling isn't very strong, and my fridge is incredibly solid. Sadly, None of it was caught on camera. Looking back, I probably would have laughed watching it. Basically, I grabbed onto the temporary telecom section of my electrical board above me. Of course, it wasn't actually secured to the cable trunking. It came loose instantly. I lost my balance and landed straight onto the corner of the fridge below. Thankfully, nobody was underneath me. I probably ended up with at least one cracked rib in my back, although I never had it checked. No time for x-rays. The renovation had to keep moving. You won't really notice it in the rest of the video, but every single movement hurt, and I spent the next few weeks quietly calculating every move before making it. Anyway, no point feeling sorry for myself. Time to make room for the rest of the new structure. I set up my laser to establish both the height and alignment, then stretch a chalk line that represents the underside of the new beam. The beam will sit slightly lower so it can be partially housed into the beam above the front door. This chalk line gives me the exact height for the two support posts. The original door frame was made from tropical hardwood and will eventually disappear inside the wall lining. For this new structure, I'm using chestnut timber. Working with the two support posts already standing makes everything much easier. Since my chestnut beam isn't long enough, I'll extend it using a Jupiter scarf joint, which I think looks particularly elegant. Ideally, this type of joint is used where it's mainly under tension. In my case, it'll carry weight, so I made sure the joint sits directly above a support post, where it won't be subjected to bending forces. To make life easier, I build myself a cardboard template. I simply trace the exact beam dimensions before drawing the joint. As for the central key, the proportion suggested by the original formula looked a little too small to me. After a bit more research, I settled on a slightly beefier design. Now I just cut out the template. Using an offcut, I make the locking key, which consists of two opposing wedges that tighten against each other. I started with the opening size before cutting it diagonally. Next come the mortises and both support posts, using exactly the same technique as I used on the front door. At this point, I'm using every trick I can think of to lift the beam into place, while still dealing with some pretty painful ribs. Now it's time for the drawbore peg holes. The hole in the tenon is drilled slightly offset from the hole in the mortise. When the slightly tapered wooden peg is driven through, it naturally pulls the joint tightly together. Speaking of pegs, here's how I made them from a scrap piece of chestnut. I drilled the test hole in a scrap board using the final diameter so I could fine-tune the fit. The goal is to make them as snug as possible. I can now fit the second half of the beam. I still need to cut the housing on the right-hand side so everything lines up perfectly. All that's left is driving in the 2 wedges that make up the locking key, and this joint isn't going anywhere. I also add a small decorative peg to the door frame. The tenon is far too short for it to serve any structural purpose, but I think it looks much nicer. And that's the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Thanks for watching RenovHome. See you next time. I'm Ludo.